The huge metal space station called Nexus Prime floated in the darkness between stars. Inside its main hall, thousands of beings from different worlds had come to watch the biggest military ceremony in the galaxy. The hall was so large that 50 Earth football fields could fit inside it. Bright lights made everything shine like stars, and the air smelled of strange flowers from dozens of different planets. General Veldar stood in the center of it all. He was massive, almost 9 feet tall, with dark green scales covering his body like armor. His 4 powerful arms were crossed over his chest, and old battle scars marked his face and hands. For 300 years, he had been the most feared military leader in known space. 12 different star systems had tried to fight against him, and 12 different star systems had lost. The crowd watched him with a mixture of fear and respect. Some beings whispered to each other in their own languages, but everyone knew who he was. Children from warrior races grew up hearing stories about Veldar the Conqueror, Veldar the Unstoppable, Veldar the Legend. Far from the center, in a small section marked with Earth's blue flag, Captain Kim Jin-woo sat quietly with his team. He wore a simple dark blue uniform with silver buttons, nothing fancy or decorated like the other military officers around them. His black hair was cut short and neat, and his dark eyes watched everything carefully. He was 35 years old, which made him very young compared to most of the military leaders in the room. Next to him sat Lieutenant Park Saman, a woman with long black hair tied back in a tight bun. She was looking at her electronic notebook, reading information about all the different species in the room. On Jinwoo's other side, Lieutenant Choi Miho kept moving in his chair. He was nervous being around so many powerful alien warriors. All 3 humans looked small and ordinary compared to the giants and monsters and strange beings that filled the hall. The ceremony had been going on for 2 hours. One by one, military leaders from different worlds came forward to praise Veldar's achievements. They talked about battles where he had destroyed entire rebel fleets. They described planets where he had crushed uprisings before they could spread. They told stories of enemies who had surrendered just hearing his name. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 5 years ago. Before that, Earth had been alone, not knowing that millions of other intelligent species existed among the stars. When humans finally developed faster-than-light travel and made contact with the galaxy, most alien races had been surprised. Humans looked weak and soft compared to warriors like Veldar. They had no scales or claws or natural weapons. They were not very strong or very fast. Many aliens wondered how such fragile creatures had survived long enough to reach the stars. The human military was small compared to the great armies of the galaxy. Earth could only send 3 officers to represent their entire planet at this ceremony. Most of the other species had sent dozens of representatives, all wearing fancy uniforms covered with medals and decorations. As the ceremony continued, a tall alien with purple skin and 4 eyes walked to the center of the hall. He carried a golden box that contained the most important military award in the galaxy, the Galactic Order of Strategic Excellence. Only 5 beings in all of history had ever received this honor. Veldar would be the 6th. The purple alien opened the box and pulled out a crystal medal that seemed to glow with its own light. His voice boomed through speakers that translated his words into hundreds of different languages. For 3 centuries of unmatched military service, for bringing order to chaos across 12 star systems, for victories that will be remembered until the end of time, the Galactic Council awards General Veldar the Order of Strategic Excellence. The crowd exploded with noise. Beings cheered, roared, howled, and made whatever sounds their species used to show excitement. Some aliens stamped their feet, others clapped multiple hands, and a few shot colored lights from their bodies. Veldar stepped forward to accept the medal. His voice was deep and powerful, like thunder rolling across mountains. When he spoke, every other sound in the hall stopped. For 300 years, I have served the cause of galactic order. I have brought strength to the weak and discipline to the chaotic. I have shown countless worlds that some beings are born to lead, and others are born to follow. Today, I promise that I will continue to serve, continue to conquer, and continue to prove that might makes right in this universe. More cheering filled the hall. The humans clapped politely, but their faces remained neutral. They had heard these kinds of speeches before from military leaders on their own world. They knew the difference between confidence and arrogance. As the official ceremony ended, servants began bringing out food and drinks for the reception. Beings from different worlds mingled and talked, sharing stories and making business deals. The humans stayed mostly to themselves, knowing they were outsiders in this gathering of galactic powers. Jinwoo watched Veldar carefully. The general was surrounded by admirers, telling war stories and accepting praise from younger officers. His voice carried across the room as he described battles and conquests. Something about the way he talked made Jinwoo uncomfortable, but he could not yet put his finger on what bothered him. Little did any of them know that before this night was over, the legend of Veldar would meet something he had never encountered before, the stubborn pride of humanity. The reception hall buzzed with hundreds of conversations in dozens of different languages. Tall tables covered with strange foods and colorful drinks were scattered around the room. Some of the food moved by itself and some of the drinks changed colors when you looked at them. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, business deals, and war stories being shared between old friends and new allies. General Veldar stood near the center of the room like a dark mountain surrounded by admirers. His 4 arms gestured wildly as he told story after story about his greatest battles. Younger officers from many different worlds crowded around him, hanging on his every word. Some had scales like him, others had fur or feathers or skin that glowed in the dark. All of them looked at Veldar with the same expression of awe and fear. The rebellion on Ketos 7 lasted exactly 43 minutes, Veldar was saying, his deep voice carrying across the room. Their so-called freedom fighters had been planning their uprising for months. They thought they were ready for war. They were wrong. He paused to drink from a cup that was almost too small for his massive hands. I dropped my shock troopers directly onto their main base. No warning, no negotiation, no mercy. By the time the sun set that day, their rebellion was nothing but smoke and memories. The crowd around him laughed and cheered. A young officer with blue skin and tentacles instead of hair asked, "What happened to their leaders, General?" Veldar's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile, showing rows of sharp teeth. Leaders? After 43 minutes, they had no leaders left to worry about. Captain Jinwoo stood about 20 feet away with his 2 officers, listening but not participating. They had been trying to blend into the background, but their human appearance made that impossible. Everywhere they went, aliens stared at them with curiosity. Some seemed friendly, others looked suspicious, and a few appeared to be sizing them up like predators studying potential prey. Lieutenant Miho was having trouble enjoying the party. He kept thinking about friends back on Earth, especially the ones who were no longer alive. The cheerful atmosphere around him felt wrong somehow, like celebrating while people were still dying in battles across the galaxy. "You seem troubled," Lieutenant Salmon said quietly, moving closer to her friend. Miho nodded slowly. "This whole thing feels strange to me. All these stories about crushing rebellions and destroying enemies. What about the people who died? What about the families who lost everything?" "It is how warriors talk," Jinwoo said softly. "They focus on victory, not on loss." "Taeho would have hated this," Miho whispered, thinking of his best friend who had died 6 months ago. "He always said that good soldiers fight to protect people, not to win glory." Sergeant Lee Taeho had been Miho's closest friend since their academy days. They had served together for 5 years through 3 different conflicts. Taeho had been funny and kind, always trying to help younger soldiers and always putting others before himself. He had died on a mining colony called New Seoul, holding a defensive position while civilians evacuated. Enemy pirates had been attacking the colony, trying to steal valuable minerals. Taeho could have retreated with the other soldiers, but he stayed behind to buy time for the families to escape. He saved 237 lives, including 43 children. The pirates killed him, but not before the evacuation was complete. "He died a hero," Salmon said gently. "He died doing what was right," Miho replied. "That is more important than being a hero." Unfortunately, Miho had forgotten that many alien species had much better hearing than humans. Veldar's reptilian ears had evolved to catch the smallest sounds on ancient hunting grounds. Even across the noisy room, he had heard every word of the humans' quiet conversation. The general's storytelling suddenly stopped. His 4 arms lowered to his sides, and his scarred head turned toward the human officers like a weapon finding its target. The crowd around him noticed the change and grew quiet, following his gaze. "Did I hear correctly?" Veldar's voice boomed across the room, much louder than necessary. "One of your warriors died defending civilians?" The entire reception hall began to fall silent. Conversations stopped in waves as beings turned to watch what was happening. Jinwoo felt his stomach tighten. This was exactly the kind of attention they had hoped to avoid. Veldar began walking toward them, his massive form pushing through the crowd like a warship cutting through space. Other beings stepped aside quickly, not wanting to be in his path. "Tell me more about this heroic death," he said, making the word heroic sound like an insult. Miho's face turned red with anger, but Jinwoo put a warning hand on his arm. "It was a private conversation, General," the captain said calmly. "Nothing is private when spoken in my presence," Veldar replied, now standing directly in front of the three humans. Up close he was even more intimidating. His shadow fell over them like a dark cloud, and the scars on his scales told stories of 100 battles. Your friend died for civilians, yes? For people who were not soldiers. He died saving lives, Miho said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Veldar threw back his head and laughed. The sound was harsh and cruel like metal scraping against stone. How wonderfully naive. Any real warrior knows that civilians are expendable. Military objectives always come first. Resources, strategic positions, tactical advantages, these things matter. People who cannot fight for themselves are simply, what is your human word? Baggage. The room was now completely silent. Even the alien servants had stopped moving to listen. Your sergeant. Veldar paused, pretending to think. What was his name again? Li Teho, Miho said through gritted teeth. Ah yes, Li Teho. Veldar pronounced the name slowly and mockingly, like he was tasting something unpleasant. He threw away his life for nothing. Absolutely nothing. Any competent commander would have used those civilians as shields or bargaining chips. Your friend died because humans clearly lack the killer instinct necessary for real warfare. You are too soft, too emotional, too weak to understand that war is about winning, not about playing hero. Lieutenant Samon's hands were shaking with rage. Captain Jinwoo's jaw was so tight it looked like it might break. But it was Miho who stepped forward, his fear completely overwhelmed by anger. Sergeant Teho was worth 10 of you, he said in a voice that carried clearly across the silent room. Veldar's eyes glittered with cruel amusement. He had found exactly what he was looking for, a chance to humiliate these upstart humans in front of the entire galactic military community. Was he really? The general asked, his voice dripping with false politeness. Perhaps we should test that theory. The silence in the reception hall was so complete that you could hear the air recycling systems humming in the walls. Every eye in the room was focused on the three humans standing before the legendary General Veldar. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Captain Jinwoo stepped forward, placing himself between Miho and the towering alien general. His voice was calm and steady, but there was steel underneath the politeness. General Veldar, I formally request a tactical exercise between our forces. Veldar's scarred face showed surprise for just a moment before his cruel smile returned. You want to challenge me? Little human, I have been commanding armies since before your species learned to fly between the stars. A war game scenario, Jinwoo continued, ignoring the insult. To test strategic thinking and battlefield execution. Unless, of course, you are concerned about your reputation. A low murmur ran through the crowd. No one had ever questioned Veldar's courage before. The general's forearms tensed, and his reptilian eyes narrowed dangerously. Several alien officers stepped back, expecting an explosion of violence. But Veldar was too smart to lose his temper completely. He looked around the room at all the watching faces, admirers, rivals, and political allies all waiting to see how he would respond. His pride would not let him back down from such a public challenge, especially from a species that most of the galaxy considered weak. You amuse me, human, Veldar said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Very well. Consider this a lesson in military hierarchy. When I crush your pathetic forces, perhaps other young species will learn proper respect for their betters. The crowd began talking excitedly. News of the challenge spread through the reception like wildfire. Within minutes, beings were placing bets and calling their friends on other ships to tell them what was happening. It had been decades since anyone had dared challenge Veldar to single combat, and never in such a public way. Admiral Kextar, an elderly being with purple skin and 4 glowing eyes, stepped forward to act as mediator. He had organized war games for over a century and was respected by all sides. Gentlemen, if we are to do this properly, we need to establish clear parameters. What type of exercise did you have in mind? Planetary defense scenario, Jinwoo said immediately. Each commander gets a mixed species unit. The goal is to protect civilian populations while achieving military objectives. Veldar laughed harshly. Of course you would choose a scenario involving civilians. Very well, I accept these terms. How large will our forces be? 100 soldiers each, Admiral Kextar suggested. The exercise will take place on Training World Gamma 7. It has cities, mountains, forests, and deserts, a perfect testing ground for tactical flexibility. When? Veldar demanded. 3 days from now. That gives both commanders time to select their forces and develop strategies. The two leaders shook hands, though Veldar's massive clawed hand completely engulfed Jinwoo's human one. Flash photography from a dozen different news services captured the moment. By tomorrow, every military academy in the galaxy would be talking about this unprecedented challenge. As the crowd began to disperse, beings immediately started forming groups to discuss what they had witnessed. The betting pools were already heavily favoring Veldar at 20-1 odds. Most aliens could not imagine any scenario where humans could defeat the galaxy's greatest military mind. Over the next 2 days, both commanders began selecting their forces. Veldar's choices surprised no one. He picked the most elite warriors from the galaxy's premier fighting species. Cortex shock troopers with their natural armor and lightning-fast reflexes. Valdran berserkers whose battle rage made them nearly unstoppable in close combat. Nexary assault specialists who could fly and fight in 3 dimensions. His roster read like a list of the most dangerous predators in known space. Each soldier was a veteran of multiple campaigns. Each one had killed enemies in dozens of different ways. They were trained to follow orders without question and to show no mercy to anyone who stood in their path. Veldar's strategy was simple and proven: use overwhelming force to crush the enemy before they could react. Captain Jinwu's selections raised eyebrows throughout Nexus Prime Station. Yes, he chose some human soldiers including Lieutenant Miho and Lieutenant Saman. But he also selected beings that most military experts would never consider for combat roles. Thylorian engineers who were small and physically weak but incredibly intelligent. Centauri medics whose species had evolved from peaceful herbivores. Altarian communication specialists who had never fired a weapon in anger. He even chose members of species that were considered non-combatants by galactic military standards: Eldari philosophers, Zephyrian artists, and Quillan farmers who had joined the peacekeeping force as support staff. Military analysts were baffled by these choices. Some thought Jinwu was trying to make a political statement about equality. Others believed he was throwing the match to avoid a humiliating defeat. A few wondered if the human captain had suffered some kind of mental breakdown from the pressure. What is he thinking? Lieutenant General Mordak asked his aide as they reviewed the team selections. Those beings are not warriors. They are technicians and healers and artists. Veldar will massacre them. But there were a few observers who noticed something interesting in Jinwu's choices. Every single being he selected had a reputation for loyalty and teamwork. Many had served together before in peacekeeping missions. They might not be the strongest or the fastest, but they trusted each other completely. On the morning of the 3rd day, both teams boarded transport ships for Training World Gamma 7. The planet was a perfect laboratory for military exercises. It had been terraformed specifically for war games, with realistic cities full of holographic civilians, challenging terrain, and monitoring systems that could track every movement. News crews from 30 different worlds had arrived to cover the exercise. Military academies scheduled special viewing sessions for their students. Even the Galactic Council had sent official observers to witness what many were calling the most important war game in decades. As the transport ships descended toward the planet's surface, Veldar sat in his command chair reviewing tactical maps. His confidence was absolute. He had won every major battle of his career using the same basic approach: identify the enemy's weakness, apply maximum pressure, and crush them before they could adapt. In the other transport, Captain Jinwu was talking quietly with his diverse team. He was not giving orders or making speeches about victory. Instead, he was listening to each team member's ideas and concerns. The Thylorian engineer had suggestions for quick fortification techniques. The Centauri medic wanted to establish field hospitals near civilian areas. The Altarian communications specialist had plans for coordinating between species who had never worked together before. As both ships touched down on opposite sides of Training World Gamma 7, the galaxy prepared to witness something unprecedented. The greatest military legend in galactic history was about to face an enemy unlike any he had encountered before, an enemy that fought not for glory or conquest, but for each other. The war game was about to begin. The morning sun rose over Training World Gamma 7 as both armies took their positions. The planet's monitoring systems activated, sending live video feeds to thousands of viewers across the galaxy. In military academies, command centers, and government buildings, beings gathered around screens to watch the most anticipated war game in decades. General Veldar stood on a hill overlooking the main battlefield, his 4 arms crossed confidently over his chest. Through his binoculars, he could see the enemy positions in the distance. Captain Jinwu's mixed-species force looked small and disorganized compared to his elite warriors. This would be over quickly. "Begin the assault," Veldar ordered into his communicator. What happened next was exactly what military experts had predicted. Veldar's forces moved like a perfect machine of destruction. His Kortek shock troopers charged across the open ground with their natural armor deflecting simulated weapons fire. The Valdaran berserkers howled their battle cries as they smashed through the first defensive line. His Nexhari assault specialists flew overhead, raining down covering fire from above. The human-led force appeared to crumble immediately. Within the first hour they were in full retreat, abandoning positions and running toward the mountains. Several of Jinwa's team members were marked as casualties by the training computers. The betting pools on Nexus Prime Station began paying out early winnings to those who had backed Veldar. "This is embarrassing," commented Admiral Kextar as he watched the feeds from the command center. "The humans are being slaughtered." But Lieutenant General Mordak, who had been studying military tactics for over 2 centuries, frowned at his display screen. "Something is wrong. Look at their retreat pattern. It is too organized, too controlled." On the battlefield, what looked like panic was actually careful planning. As Jinwa's forces fell back, the Thylorian engineers were rapidly building something in the mountain passes, not just defensive walls, but a complex network of tunnels and hidden positions. The Centauri medics were not just treating wounded soldiers, they were setting up medical stations that could quickly get casualties back into action. Most importantly, something unprecedented was happening between the different species on Jinwa's team. A human soldier threw himself in front of simulated enemy fire to protect a Thylorian engineer. The engineer, grateful for being saved, worked twice as hard to build better defenses. A Centauri medic ran through dangerous territory to reach wounded humans, and the humans fought harder to protect her in return. By the third hour, Veldar was becoming frustrated. His forces had taken most of the lowland areas, but the enemy kept slipping away. Every time his troops thought they had won a complete victory, they discovered that most of the enemy had escaped to fight again somewhere else. "Where are they going?" he demanded from his communications officer. "Sir, they appear to be regrouping in the mountain regions. Also, our scouts report that they are—" "Sir, this is strange, they are building something." Veldar grabbed his binoculars and studied the distant mountains. Through the rocky peaks he could see movement. Lots of movement. His enemies were not just hiding, they were working together on some kind of large project. The fourth hour brought the first real surprise. Veldar's advance forces reached the mountain passes and found them heavily fortified. But these were not normal military fortifications. The Thylorian engineers had created a maze of defensive positions that seemed to flow naturally with the landscape. Passages that looked empty were actually filled with hidden soldiers. Walls that appeared weak were reinforced with clever engineering techniques. More disturbing was what happened when Veldar's troops attacked these positions. The defenders did not fight like separate units from different species. They fought like a single organism. When Kortek shock troopers charged a human position, Altarian communication specialists coordinated fire from 3 different directions. When Valdaran berserkers tried to break through Centauri medical stations, the medics were protected by soldiers from 4 different worlds who moved together like they had been training together for years. Hour 5 brought a revelation that changed everything. Veldar's intercepted communications revealed something he had never encountered in 3 centuries of warfare. Soldiers from different species were volunteering to sacrifice themselves for each other. A human private deliberately drew enemy fire away from a wounded Thylorian. A Centauri medic refused to evacuate an aid station because human soldiers were still bringing in casualties. An elderly philosopher, who had never fired a weapon before this exercise, held a defensive position alone so that others could escape. These were not the actions of hired soldiers or allied armies. These beings genuinely cared about each other's survival. By hour 6, Veldar realized he was no longer advancing. His forces controlled more territory than the enemy, but they were stuck. Every position they captured was empty. Every victory led to another battle somewhere else. His elite warriors were becoming tired and frustrated, while the enemy seemed to be getting stronger and more coordinated. The turning point came during hour 7. Jinwa's forces launched their first major counterattack, and it came from a completely unexpected direction. Instead of trying to retake lost ground, they struck at Veldar's supply lines and communication networks. Suddenly, his perfectly organized army found itself cut into isolated pieces that could not talk to each other. At the same time, something even more remarkable happened. The casualties that Veldar thought he had eliminated early in the battle began reappearing. The Centauri medics had been so effective at treating wounded soldiers that many beings marked as dead by the computers were able to return to combat. The enemy force was actually growing larger as the battle continued. In the command center on Nexus Prime, military observers watched in amazement as their screens showed the impossible. Veldar's overwhelming advantages were melting away. His superior firepower meant nothing when he could not find targets. His elite warriors were being outmaneuvered by engineers and medics. His 3 centuries of tactical experience were useless against an enemy that fought by completely different rules. How is this happening? Admiral Kekstar whispered. Lieutenant General Mordak stared at the displays with growing understanding. They are not fighting to win, he said slowly. They are fighting to protect each other. It makes them unpredictable. On Training World Gamma 7, General Valdar stood on his hill and watched his perfect military machine begin to fall apart. For the first time in 300 years he was losing a battle. And he had no idea how to stop it. Hour 8 of the war game brought chaos to General Veldar's forces. What had started as a simple military exercise had turned into his worst nightmare. His communications were cut, his supply lines were broken, and his elite warriors were scattered across Training World Gamma 7 like leaves in a storm. In the command center on Nexus Prime Station, thousands of viewers watched their screens in stunned silence. The impossible was happening. The greatest military legend in galactic history was not just losing, he was being completely destroyed by a force that should not have been able to fight at all. Sir, we are receiving surrender requests from 3 of our forward units, Veldar's communications officer reported, his voice shaking with disbelief. Surrender? Veldar roared. My warriors do not surrender. Order them to fight to the last soldier. Sir, they say they are surrounded and cut off from support. The enemy appears to be everywhere at once. Veldar grabbed his binoculars and looked toward the simulated city in the valley below. The exercise scenario included thousands of holographic civilians who needed to be protected during the battle. Originally, he had planned to ignore them completely, they were just obstacles that slowed down real military operations. But now he could see that Captain Jinwoo had turned civilian protection into a weapon. Every time Veldar's forces tried to advance through the city, they found themselves fighting not just enemy soldiers, but an entire population that had been organized into an effective resistance network. The holographic civilians were providing intelligence, carrying supplies, and even helping wounded enemy soldiers escape to safety. This is not how war works. Veldar shouted at his tactical display. Civilians are supposed to run away, not fight back. The 9th hour brought complete disaster. Veldar's remaining forces had been pushed back to their original starting positions, but now they found themselves surrounded. Somehow, Captain Jinwoo's mixed-species army had managed to circle around behind them during the confusion. But the worst shock came when Veldar realized who was leading the final assault against his position. Lieutenant Choi Miho, the young human who had spoken about his dead friend, was advancing directly toward Veldar's command post. The lieutenant was leading a desperate charge across open ground that should have been suicide. Any normal military commander would have ordered his troops to mow down the attackers with concentrated fire. It was a simple tactical situation. Enemies running across open ground with no cover. Veldar gave the order to his remaining Cortex shock troopers. But then something happened that broke every rule of warfare Veldar had ever learned. As his troops opened fire on Miho's charge, soldiers from 6 different species threw themselves into the line of fire to protect the human lieutenant. A Thylorian engineer tackled Miho to the ground just as simulated bullets passed through the space where his head had been. A Centauri medic used her own body to shield wounded humans as they crawled toward safety. An elderly philosopher, who had never seen combat before this day, grabbed a weapon and returned fire to cover the retreat of fallen comrades. Most shocking of all, these beings were not even from Miho's military unit. They were volunteers from completely different backgrounds who had decided to risk their lives for a human they barely knew. They are all insane. Veldar screamed. Why are they dying for each other? The charge should have failed. By every military manual ever written, it should have been a massacre. But instead it succeeded. Miho's combined species assault team reached Veldar's command post and overwhelmed the defenders through sheer determination and teamwork. When the training computers announced the end of the exercise, Veldar found himself staring at a tactical display that showed total defeat. His legendary army had been completely destroyed. His centuries of military experience had been proven worthless. His reputation as an unstoppable conqueror lay in ruins. In the observation bunker, 300 years of military genius sat in stunned silence. Around him, junior officers whispered in amazement and fear. The galaxy had just watched the impossible happen, and no one knew what it meant for the future. Captain Jinwoo entered the bunker quietly, followed by his mixed-species team. They were tired and dirty from the battle, but there was something in their eyes that Veldar had never seen before, not triumph or pride but satisfaction. They had fought for something bigger than themselves and they had won. The human captain walked up to where Veldar sat slumped in his chair. For a moment, the two commanders looked at each other in silence. Then Jinwoo spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the bunker. Sergeant Lee Taeho died exactly as he lived, General. Making others stronger through his sacrifice. You called that weakness, but you were wrong. That is the most dangerous strength in the galaxy. Veldar looked up at the small human standing before him. I do not understand. How did you defeat me? I have the best warriors, the best weapons, the best strategies. I have won every battle for 3 centuries. You fought enemies who were like you, Jinwoo replied simply. You never fought enemies who were willing to die for each other. Lieutenant Miho stepped forward, his face serious but not angry. Sergeant Taeho saved 237 people when he died. Today his sacrifice saved us all. That is what you will never understand, General. We do not fight to win glory. We fight to protect what we love. As the human team walked away talking and laughing together like old friends, Veldar remained in his chair. He stared at the tactical display showing his complete defeat, finally understanding that everything he thought he knew about warfare had been wrong. The galaxy had just discovered its new legends. They did not fight for conquest or glory or personal achievement. They fought for each other, and that made them unstoppable. The age of Veldar was over. The age of humanity had begun.